Hey everyone, how's things? So obviously Photoshop is the most common method for creating thumbnails in YouTube. However, is it really the best method? I actually create probably 60% of my thumbnails in Illustrator, including this one that you've probably seen. I imagine I probably use this for this video. And it's not right for everything. Obviously, there's a lot of things that Illustrator can't do. However, there's a lot of things that I think it actually exceeds at, that it's better than Photoshop at. And I think more people should probably create more thumbnails in Illustrator. So here I am just browsing the trending tab on YouTube, as I often do, and just sort of speculating what these creators use to create their thumbnails. So for the most part, these all have two main common underlying elements, right? There's the photograph or a still from the video itself, and then there's a text element, either some descriptive text or something more of a logo type. And on almost all of these, the text element, where it even exists, is really pretty static. Sometimes there's a bit of a gradient, or they might be semi-transparent. But of all these thumbnails, I would say there's maybe 2 or 3 that you could not easily create in Illustrator. And for all the most basic ones and some of the more complicated ones, I'd say it probably would actually be a lot faster to create these in Illustrator than Photoshop. So let's take a look at why that might be. So jumping back over to Illustrator, and here's probably the thumbnail that you guys clicked on to get to this video, and it's pretty abstract, and I created this in just a few minutes in Illustrator, and I think it exemplifies Illustrator's primary strength, and it's the one probably the most people know it for, and that's, you know, creating something from nothing, essentially, what it sounds like. Illustrator, right? You're essentially drawing shapes and playing with geometry and making something visually appealing and interesting without having a photograph. But there's a lot of other things that Illustrator exceeds at as well. So I'm just going to create a new document here, and you can see that the last preset I used was for 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is a standard HD definition. I think you can go as low as 1280 by 720 for custom YouTube thumbnails, but you may as well go 1920 by 1080 and future-proof yourself and make sure that they are nice and crisp on all devices. Next, we want to go over here to File and Document Color Mode real quick and just make sure we have RGB color selected. So let's say instead of creating something really abstract like this, I want to create a more, traditional video thumbnail for this tutorial. So I'm just going to screen cap my Illustrator program here. Now I'm just going to drag that screen cap into the new Illustrator document here, and this is going to be the background. Now say I want to make it look as if this is on a computer screen in a photograph. So I'm going to go back to my browser here and bring up trusty old pixabay.com, which is a really handy website. It's an entirely free stock photo website. I'm just going to search Mac, and I'm just looking for a nice kind of flat, simple screen. Here's something that implies graphic design. So let's go ahead and download that, and we'll just drag it right into our Illustrator document along with this screen cap. And I'm just basically holding Shift as I drag the corners to keep the image at the same aspect ratio. If I don't hold Shift, you can see it can distort. So I'm going to hold Shift as I scale it up, dragging from the corner. And here I'm just hitting Command, Shift, and square bracket, the opening square bracket, and that's sending it to the very back of the image. So basically it's behind the screen cap here. And now I'm going to align my screenshot the same way so that it's basically over the screen of the iMac here. And you can see there's a bit of overlap here. It's not really the right aspect ratio again, but that's okay. I'm just going to click on the screen cap here and up where it says opacity. I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 50% just so I can see what I'm doing. So now I can see the edge of the computer screen in the photograph, and I'm going up here to my rectangle tool, or you can just hit M on your keyboard, and I'm just going to drag roughly over where the edges of the iMac are in this photograph. So I'm essentially just going to use this white box to crop this image behind it, just like you would with a mask in Photoshop if you're familiar with that. And with those both selected, I'm going to right click and say Make Clipping Mask. And now I can double click to go into this mask. Here we have the original image of the screen cap, and now I can drag it around here, and if I click out of that clipping mask, you'll see it's still keeping within those bounds. And now that I'm happy with placement, I can turn the opacity back up to 100. There you go. So basically probably about the same amount of time that would have taken me to do in Photoshop. So now, because I want this all basically to behave as one image, I'm just going to shift click the contents of the iMac and the photograph of the iMac, and I'm going to hit Command G on a Mac, or you can go to Object and group. And now with a single click, I'm dragging around both of these elements, and when I shift and drag the edge of the screen, they're both going to scale proportionately. Just realizing I should have zoomed in on this part of the thumbnail here, because that's obviously a little more appealing and interesting than all the gray. So to fix that, I'm going to click into the clipping mask again and drill down. So here we've got basically the main image, and if I double click, now we've got the group, which is this plus this together. And then I double click again now to get into my original clipping mask, and now I've selected the actual screen cap, and now I can hit Command C. Basically that was copy, so you can also go to edit copy, and then I'm going to hit Shift Command V or paste in place to make a duplicate of this in the exact same place. So I just hit that, and there's actually two of these images now. You can't see them because they're literally right over top of each other, but there they are. So now what I'm going to do is make another clipping mask over just this portion of the image. So again, I create a rectangle. The rectangle is empty, it's clear, because I didn't assign a fill color, which I just did there. Doesn't matter whether there's a fill or not. We have a rectangle, and then we click the image, and we're going to right click and say make clipping mask. And if you're really not familiar with Illustrator and you're wondering why this rectangle is just a square box and this one has these lines through it, basically it's to indicate that a rasterized image, which is something that's not a vector shape, which is basically any geometric shape that is formed through mathematic calculations, to make a long story short. Anything that's rasterized is going to show with these lines, and anything that is a vector shape is just going to appear as a simple shape. So again, just clicking the rectangle and clicking the rasterized image and right click and say make clipping mask. And now I can scale up this image and basically make it look like I was zoomed right up in on that Illustrator artboard. I'm just double clicking outside basically to get back out of the group. So this black box obviously is the artboard that we assigned, so we know that's the section that's actually going to be seen once we export this image. But just to avoid confusion, we can also, guess what, use our handy clipping mask tool. Right click, make clipping mask, and now we have a more accurate representation of the crop factor. So here we have basically, again, we have a photograph. That's one common standard element on any YouTube thumbnail. The other thing would be text. Watch before you try. It's a little bit clickbaity. I find anything that's watch before you try or watch before you buy, you know, anyone who's sort of interested in that topic is going to just be that much more compelled to take a look. This is basically identical to Photoshop's UI, if you're familiar with that. I really think this should match a color that's already elsewhere in the image, so I can hit I to bring up the eyedropper and just select any color that I want to try and match. What's really cool with Illustrator though is that, let's just say for example, I was using two different typefaces here. So say I've done this, but I've decided that I actually want it all just to be one font because I think this looks silly, which I do. I can hit I for my eyedropper tool, and again, I can just select any color, but if I select another actual type element in Illustrator, it won't only match the color, but it will also match the actual typographic treatment. So let's say this is blue. I'm gonna hit here and it's gone blue, but it's also adopted the same size and the same typeface and everything else. Okay, but there's something kind of missing here, right? Most YouTube thumbnails, I think most really effective YouTube thumbnails have characters in them. And this is proven science. I mean, there's all kinds of studies that suggest people are more drawn to images with human faces in them, or any faces, but especially human faces. And when I'm looking through here in YouTube, I can see in a lot of them the faces are part of the photograph that is already used for the background, but in other ones, and this is a pretty common kind of style now, we see somebody cropped out and placed in front of the background, often emphasized by some kind of an outline or maybe a drop shadow or some different sort of effect to really separate them from the background in sort of an exaggerated and even cartoony fashion. Now in Illustrator, we can sort of do this. Like for example, if this box, if I wanted to crop it out, I can use the pen tool to draw a shape around it and then use my clipping mask. And then I have just a shape of this box, and I can put that in front of a background, and I could do that even with something as complex as a human figure, but it's a little clumsy compared to Photoshop. So this is one area where if you're going to be doing a lot of that sort of masking and cropping, I would suggest probably jumping over into Photoshop, or you can just use Photoshop to create the masks. So this is something where in Photoshop I just drew around myself with the pen tool, and this is an actual Photoshop document that I just dragged and dropped into Illustrator. And the benefit of doing it this way versus exporting some like a transparent PNG or something, I can now go to Window and Links, and that brings up this little dialog here, and essentially this gives me a list of all the assets, the rendered rasterized images that I've placed in this document. So here's the PSD, and it recognizes that it is a PSD. So I can click this Edit Original button, and it's going to open Photoshop, and I can make changes to the image right here. And any changes that I do make are instantly going to be integrated into the Illustrator document. Let's just give myself red eyes, because why not? File, Save, Command S, and here right away it's bringing up a dialog. Would you like to modify links in this document? Yes, I would. And there we go. There's Vampire Me. I don't actually want red eyes, so I'm going to undo that and save again. But what about that outline we talked about? Well, there's a couple different ways we can do that even within Illustrator. If we click here on this sort of sun-looking shape, or you might have to go to Window Appearance, depending on what UI you're using. By the way, you can change the Workspace UI up here in Workspace. I'm using Essentials Classic. And now we get this little familiar FX dialog, like something you might see again in Photoshop in the Layers palette. And here under Stylize, we have some of the familiar kind of go-to effects that are often applied to separate people or objects from the background. For example, drop shadow and outer glow are probably the two most common. So I'm just going to create a white outer glow here. We can change our opacity and our blur. It is going to be a little bit slower to rasterize sometimes, or to render, rather than in Photoshop. We've got this nice outer glow, and we can exaggerate it quite a lot here. It's usually pretty exaggerated on YouTube thumbnails. But let's say I want to create like a really heavy, more like an outline using this existing shape. And in Photoshop, obviously you can just sort of command hit on a given channel or path, and you get like a nice outline of the shape. But here in Illustrator, when I click on it, it's giving me this giant big bounding box, which is basically the dimensions of the original photograph that I was cropped out of. So that's not very helpful. So let's hit Option or Alt and drag this image off the artboard here and go up to Object. And we're going to go under Image Trace, Make and Expand. And I copied this because obviously I want to keep the original, while I also want to create a simplified outline. So it's basically just recognized the light and dark sections and created this very sort of inky Illustrated-esque version. And you can see it's all one big shape here. So I'm going to right click and say Ungroup, or again, you can go to Object Ungroup. So each individual little black speck here I can drag around, and this is sort of one big mess. But that's okay, because all I really want is this section right here. Now, because this is a vector, basically any individual little black spot here, or little white spot for that matter, is going to be its own object anywhere they're broken up. So in order to further simplify this shape, I'm just going to click off it and hit my left mouse button and drag to select everything. Now up here in the fill color, it's giving me a question mark, and that just means there's multiple colors here. So it doesn't know what to tell me. But I can still select a color, and then it's going to change all of these shapes to the same color. So now that they're all the same color, I can introduce you guys to probably my favorite single feature in Illustrator. If you guys don't know about this, this is probably the reason you don't like Illustrator, is because you haven't discovered the Pathfinder. And you can go to Window, Pathfinder to bring it up, or you might already have it in your tool palette here. Basically, the Pathfinder is a really easy way to change or alter shapes by merging them, cutting one from the other, cropping them, etc. So in this case, I just want to merge everything that's pink into one continuous shape. So I just use this merge icon here. And you can see now it's brought this down from like a whole bunch of different shapes into just a couple shapes. Obviously, there's still sort of little separate sections if I drill into this group here. So to address that, I'm just going to hit Trim. Then I'm going to grab sort of the single most obvious, biggest piece of the silhouette and drag it up here, somewhere out of the way, and I'm just going to again select and drag and delete all these little leftover crumbs. So here we go. We've got, it's not perfect, but it's sort of a very basic silhouette of myself, and I can just overlay it on the actual photograph, and then I can hit Command square open bracket, and that's going to send it back behind the layer where the photograph is. So I can make this white and give it a white border as well, and then just expand the stroke, and that's basically going to expand the whole shape evenly. I don't know if that's too much maybe, but there we go. We've got a nice big thick outline. Now I did briefly mention that there are layers within Illustrator. We haven't really used any, but it's probably about a good time to start cleaning up this document so we don't get too confused. And because we still have this giant bounding box that's sort of blocking all the background and being a real general pain in the bottom. So we're going to create a new layer here. So now everything is on layer 1. We really just want this background on layer 1. So let's just call this background. And any individual item that you click on brings up a little square colored box here. Now I know that this blue square box represents the layer that I've selected. So I'm going to click this blue box and drag it up into layer 2, which is the red layer. So this was the blue layer and this is the red layer. And now I'm going to call this characters. And I'm going to create another layer yet again by clicking this little create new layer box. And I'm going to call this one text. And what I can do now is basically I can lock just this layer that has just my photograph on it. And now when I click anywhere, that bounding box is not interfering. I can't accidentally drag that image around. I can alter the background because I haven't locked that layer, but this layer here is not going to get accidentally bumped or moved or edited. Now we've got my text is still in the background section here. So I'm going to bump that up to the text layer, which becomes the green layer. And the text, basically like any other shape, you can apply a stroke to it up here. But I think what I'm going to do instead of that is just select the text only here, Alt and drag to create a duplicate of it. So I've got the text twice here. I'm going to drag them so they're sort of overlaid. And I'm going to make this one, which is in front, this bright yellow. There we go. We've got this very kind of EC comic style creepy little typeface here. It's pretty eye-catching. I don't know if it's really appropriate, but there we go. It's suitable, right? And there's usually something a little bit funky with these where it's maybe a little bit tilted or offset, just up the level of cartooniness, if you will. I don't really like that I'm blocking the font on the background here. Let's just put the computer over my shoulder. And now we see we have this wall that doesn't expand long enough. There's a couple ways that I might be able to fix that. One is I can hit A, or I can go up here to the direct selection tool. And now when I click the border of the background here, I'm actually seeing the box that represents the clipping mask. And I can select individual corners and drag them in or out to adjust the clipping mask without moving the actual layer. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo what I just did there, and I'm going to select two corners at once, hold down Shift, click one, still holding down Shift, click the second, and I'm going to move both of those in on this side, and I'm going to do the same thing here but move both of these ones out further. But there's a problem. The image isn't actually big enough to fill in this white space here. So our clipping mask is now the right size, but the image inside the clipping mask isn't big enough to fill in this blank space. However, I know from previous experience now that I can put multiple images inside the same clipping mask, and the same clipping mask applies to all of them. So with my familiar Alt drag, I can basically create a duplicate of the background, and I can reverse it. And now when I bring it over here, now the whole image sort of repeats itself on this side, which might look a little funky, but because I don't see this box behind me, it actually happens to look just fine in this case. If I wanted to, I could also go inside this clipping mask and just create like a really abstract gradient over here. And in fact, I think that's going to look a lot nicer. So this is just a basic green shape, but I can go over here to the gradient tool. And once I click into the gradient slider, it applies the default white and black gradient colors. But by clicking on these individual tabs, I can select any other color. I can go and select this color, and I can go and select any other color on the other side. And I can also add colors in between if I want to make a really crazy rainbow colored gradient here. And I can just drag down to delete any of the colors that I don't want. But what's really powerful with the gradient tool in Illustrator is that you can select any given color and adjust the opacity so easily right here with this little button. And so now you can see that it fades out nicely towards the edge. And by clicking on the shape and then hitting G, which is the gradient tool, it brings this line up which basically represents the beginning and the end of this same gradient slider. And I can literally drag this around, rotate it, move it, and adjust how the gradient kind of flows across this existing shape. But now I've got this sort of hard edge here. So instead of using a linear gradient, let's try a radial gradient. So now it fades out in a circular shape, and I can adjust the edge of the circle to the edge of my shape, no further, otherwise again it's going to start drawing a hard edge. And I'm just going to click out of that and it'll reveal all the layers again. Okay guys, there's a whole bunch more tricks we can do basically using those same simple tools that we've seen today. Obviously you can create all kinds of other lighting effects, you can create more custom fonts and typography, you can create very fancy little shapes and icons and exclamation points and emoticons. The possibilities really are endless, but hopefully this gives you a rough idea of how to create sort of these traditional photographic YouTube thumbnails using something like Illustrator. As one final step, let's just select all the elements, which we can't do because this one's locked. So let's unlock that layer and again select all the elements, hit Command G to group everything together, and let's just make one final clipping mask over the artboard to really just clean up the edges and make sure we're happy with the final presentation. So that's a pretty good representation of how it's going to look on YouTube. So what do we do when we're ready to export this? We go File, Export, and we can use Export for Screens or Export As. This document's already an RGB document at the right size, so I'm pretty confident just exporting directly as either a PNG or a JPEG. Let's just say YouTube thumbnail. And here's a little potential gotcha. You can see here that the preview is a little bit off, and that's because it's not actually using the artboard that we've selected here, and it's including any area that any shape is in the document. And because some of these things have bounding boxes that go outside of the clipping mask, it's selecting a big giant area. So to rectify that, we go File, Export As, and this time make sure we have Use Artboards selected. Okay, and now we see we have the right crop factor. Click OK, and that's how that looks as the final image. But you guys might have noticed something that I skipped over there, which is when we go File, Export As, and say Use Artboards, there's an option for all, and because we only have one, it just produces one, but we can also basically export multiple artboards simultaneously or select a range of artboards. And this is really where Illustrator is so much more powerful than Photoshop in terms of just speed and ease of workflow. Once you get to this point where you have a few templates that you're really happy with, you have fonts that you want to use over and over again, and certain assets that you want to use over and over again, you can obviously Alt and drag and duplicate any of these individual elements, or you can select the artboard tool here, and you can actually Alt and drag to duplicate entire artboards. So say this was an entire YouTube series, and each one is sort of a very similar tutorial, but maybe just with a different topic. So to differentiate them really quickly and easily, I could really quickly, just to differentiate these, change just the color of this gradient in the corner, or I could change just the contents of the computer screen, or I could change just this font. So watch before you buy. And let's say this is third in the video series. So in this one, I'm just gonna make this red to make it look a little bit different again, kind of a nice red gradient. And let's say on this one, I can now make the font white because I think it'll stand out pretty nicely on that red. And so you can see between this and this, it already looks really remarkably different, but there's still some consistent branding. So this is where the power of Illustrator really shines, and why I think a lot more people should be using Illustrator even for these photographic style illustrations. Essentially, I think everything that I did in this picture took me about the same amount of time, maybe an extra 5 minutes at the most compared to doing it in Photoshop. But had I been in Illustrator, I would have to file, save as for each individual version I wanted to create of the thumbnail, or for each thumbnail for each video in a series. This is so much faster to basically have all my assets right here on one document and then be able to export everything simultaneously, and just to be able to edit and manipulate shapes on the fly. Illustrator really is a fantastic tool. And again, this is the more complicated stuff. If we want to make something really simple like this without photographs at all, Illustrator is without a doubt the easier solution. So if there's any interest, I'll basically go through a tutorial where I tell you how I actually created this little ditty here, and it's using all the same tools that we already talked about. It's just sort of a different approach and a slightly different workflow. So I hope you guys found that helpful. Again, I wanted to keep it pretty short. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. I'd be more than happy to drill into any of the individual features or tools that I talked about, but more so I wanted to just provide an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of Illustrator for YouTube thumbnails. Let me know in the comments below if you found this helpful. Please subscribe if you are interested in more tutorials on Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, After Effects, any Adobe products as they apply to YouTube or independent filmmaking, graphic design. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.